Joel Kotkin. Welcome back to Dad Saves America.
That's my pleasure.
Well, there's so many things we can talk about, but I do want to really hone in on California.
Okay.
This is the state that you have written about endlessly. It is sort of an avatar for a style of politics that is on offer in America,
Right.
and will certainly be on offer in the next election, probably by the governor. So I guess, how would you, we were just chatting about fascism before we started rolling. How would you just describe ideologically what the California model is?
Well, there were two British academics who did a piece, must have been 20 years ago, called The California Ideology. And what they talked about is this combination of kind of a kind of libertine, even, and libertarian idea, but with also these very progressive social views. And it's this weird amalgam, and it's basically culturally driven as opposed to traditional economic driven. And there's certainly a nature of California, which is always, and from very early on, which was very much about being an idol, being an IDYLL, idol, that it was some sort of paradise, and therefore its politics had to be the politics of paradise. And so it always has had that characteristic, with a certain amount of unreason involved, but also in some ways some very great things. But it's different. It really is a country unto itself, very much like Texas is a country unto itself. I mean, I think they would be two of the most powerful countries in the world if they were countries.
And they're like this natural. There's this natural rivalry between Texas and California.
Right.
So I'm an adoptive Texan. I've been here over 15 years now, or almost 15. So, but as a Northeasterner, I'm still always fun. My roots are still very much in the Northeast. One of the things, I guess, how should we think, looking back on like the gold rush and the sort of the founding of California and establishing its ethos? Because, like you said, it's like the notion of it being utopia. It did have this, like, okay, we're heading west. We're heading to the great unknown, to the beautiful seas or whatever. And there was the gold rush, which has like looms large in our sort of sense of history. So like lay the seeds for the California way in our past.
Well, I think that first of all, I mean, you start with Western settlement of California. I mean, if you go to California prior to the American takeover, it was a very small population of basically a few Spaniards, a lot of mestizos, and Native Americans. Almost a blank slate from a civilizational point of view. I mean, very, very minimal. You come in with people coming from the Northeast, from the Midwest, and from the South, all moving to different parts of the state. But there was this idea that you could recreate yourself. So if you were a impoverished person living in Oklahoma, or if you were a kid from Brooklyn, you could go and come and reinvent yourself in California and become a different person in a very different place, almost a different planet. So that has always been that aspect of it. And then we've had over great periods of time, many of the great writers and scientists have moved to California. I mean, I remember years ago, I was with this woman who was William Faulkner's mistress. We went to Musso and Frank's, and she said, "Oh yeah, this is where we used to go." And I mean, so there was this sense of it. And I remember we were driving along Sunset Boulevard, and she said, "Oh yeah, there's Poinsettia Street." Yeah, I said, "Why is it called that?" Because there were poinsettia farms on Sunset Boulevard. I mean, I've talked to people. I've done interviews with people one woman who was the first white woman born in Mono County, California, and she still lived in a basically a log cabin hidden in a little canyon in north of Los Angeles. I mean, so there was always this sense of it being something more than just America. It was another level. Of course, and then you had the movement of all the European filmmakers. There's always there was a funny story that a friend of mine told me. I'm old enough now that my old friends really, we go back to the past, and they said that there was a party and Otto Preminger was there, and people were speaking in English. He said, "What are you saying? You're in California. You should speak German." I mean, it was like this place of just reinvention, and a tradition that's gone on for years and years. And the whole Aztlan movement among Hispanics, this sort of that sort of cultural awakening that took place, particularly in East Los Angeles. There's always this peculiar sort of utopianism, which also, on the other side, leads to great disappointment because people actually, it's not utopia, but they think it's utopia. So if you fail in California, it's worse than failing in New York.
All right, here's your obligatory reminder to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. It really actually does help us out a lot. When we're trying to book awesome new guests, they look at how many subscribers are on the channel and they say, yep, this is worth doing. And I want to bring the best possible people to you that I can. Speaking of which, let's get back to the conversation.
You say speaking in German, I'm reminded of the series 1883, which is the precursor to Yellowstone, and it's a group of German immigrants that are supposed to be being brought to California, and of course, it's a great show to remember how much worse life was, because almost all of them are dead before they get to California.
Oh, right. Well, and that's the other thing is California was a destination. And, I remember years ago I was giving a speech in Mesa, Arizona. I'm sure the people involved are no longer involved. But he said, well, you know what? Arizona is where the people who weren't smart enough to make it to California stopped. I mean, because naturally speaking, would you really want to live in Phoenix or Los Angeles? Well, I don't know. I think Los Angeles, from a natural point of view, is infinitely better. So there was always this sort of almost mysticism, and of course, mysticism always did very well in California. There's always this, again, anything goes, anything's possible, and that's part of the allure, and that's part of the trap.
In some ways, when I think about the first people coming to the U.S. in the early 1600s, it's sort of easy to forget this. We're in the 250th anniversary year of the Declaration. And it's easy to forget that the people in the Northeast of the colonies, it was a multi-generational society at that point. It had been well over 100, 150 years of living on this continent.
Right.
So they were Americans then. It wasn't really like they were still British. There was a new culture that had taken shape.
Right.
So California is like the newest of the new world. It's like the last destination of this settling of the country.
Right. And certainly on a large scale. I mean, obviously you have Oregon and Washington, but those are not remotely in the same league. You have this sense of reinvention of America too, if you want, and that's always, I mean, frankly, that's one of the reasons I moved there in my covered Buick in 1971. And it was like being reborn. But you're in everything changed. What the weather was like, what the seasons are like, what the trees look like, what type of animals are there.
There's no bugs, which is just in and of itself almost reason to tolerate the taxes.
Right. I mean, and it's a totally different way of life. And it had enormous promise. It still has enormous promise. The problem is it's been extraordinarily badly governed for quite a long time now, and not just from the political, but also from the corporate point of view.
One of the things that is sort of hard to get your head around is that Ronald Reagan was the governor of California.
Right.
So like at the level of the like politics and culture, what happened in this past half century
Right.
that we went from, arguably the most sort of dominant and conservative and like iconic Republican president.
And Richard Nixon before him.
Right. And Richard Nixon, right. So you had multiple fairly hardcore Republican presidents coming out of California. And now that's utterly inconceivable. And if you're younger than me, the notion that this even happened seems like it's from another planet.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, the last one was, of course, Arnold, who was kind of a hybrid. But, I mean, basically, I think there are several things that happened. One, there was massive immigration from abroad, particularly from Mexico, and the Republicans managed to screw that up by playing the race card, for which they are still paying. There was the shift in the economy from a production economy to an information economy, which empowered certain kinds of people, ended up devastating the working class of California, and made the politics, crazier. And then, because so much wealth was created in Silicon Valley, particularly, there was money to build this insane welfare state. A lot of it fraudulent, but a lot of it just ridiculous. So that by the time you get to the Newsom era, the only things that are growing are basically those financed by the government, because we had this extraordinary multiplier effect at Silicon Valley. At the same time, Silicon Valley stopped producing real products, and if they did produce products, they made them in China or they made them someplace in the interior of the U.S. So I think, basically, California's economic base came. I'm working on an article called "How the West Went Red," and there are good reasons why it's going red. Because if you were working in the aerospace industry and you could be a member of the United Auto Workers or one of the unions, machinists, you wanted a good economy. You cared about economic growth. If you're a school teacher or a nurse, all you care about is how much money the government's paying. I mean, you might have some vague idea that a good economy might be good for you, but it really isn't important. I saw the same things happen to New York that earlier. And New York had 1 million manufacturing jobs in 1950, and it's got like 60,000 now. That was the whole world that I grew up in. It was completely gone.
it's the paper belt now. It's almost from Washington. A good friend of mine, Mike Gibson, wrote a book, Paper Belt on Fire. And he was basically talking about from DC to Boston, you just have paper economics, laws, finance, academia.
Right. And now what's really interesting, and I'm writing about also, is that because of artificial intelligence, sort of like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, the technoids are eating themselves. And so what you have is massive profits being made and investments being made by tech companies, but massive layoffs too, empty storefronts in Silicon Valley. And I think we're in a transition phase. And my concern as a Californian is that we'll miss this, because I think the next phase is going to be symbolized by SpaceX, by the drone makers, by the new defense companies, the application of technology into the real world. And I'm afraid we will lose that out, and that work will be going elsewhere. But if I want to feel good about California, I drive to El Segundo, and you can see all these SpaceX spinoffs, and they're doing unbelievable stuff, including one guy. I think he's 20. He must be 22 now. He designs drones for Ukraine, and he dropped out of college. He was a champion drone racer from Alaska, and that's California. That's what I liked about California. That was the kind of person that you ran into, who was visionary, who wasn't constrained. I always remember when I would go to a party, let's say, with a big law firm in New York, and people would say, "Oh, where did you go to school? Where did you go to school?" And for these people, going to Berkeley was like reform school. But I said, well, in California, we just asked, "What planet are you from?"
So I want to actually like sort of retrace some of those steps in the transformation, because it's interesting. So one of the things you mentioned was the big immigration change and the Mexican immigration, the Hispanic influx. When you said that the Republicans played the race card, what do you mean by that? Replay that for me.
That was in Pete Wilson's reelection campaign. He was running against Kathleen Brown.
Is this for governor?
For governor.
Okay. And set the stage. What year is this?
I think this is 94, I believe. Okay. There was this thing called Prop 187, which was this saying that we shouldn't give any public services to undocumented. And the Republicans used that issue to win. They really won the election for them. The problem was that the resentment that was inculcated in the Hispanic community, who are in many ways actually conservative in their values, it made them angry. I mean, I remember there would be these grainy ads that say, "They keep on coming," and sort of scaring people. Well, if you're a Hispanic, you're sitting there saying, "Well, it's my coming that's bothering you." And then I think that over the years, the education system has become completely controlled from the left. I mean, even a school like mine at Chapman, which is much better than most, but there are certain departments I wouldn't want to have anything to do with.
All of the isms and the identity stuff. Right. Basically, all of humanities has kind of been wrecked.
Yeah, and the social sciences as well. A little bit less with economics, but what's scarier to me is what's happened at the grade school level. Yeah. For instance, I had students who, when they finally were able to talk about this, they said, "Well, when I was in high school, I was told all white people are racist." And they said,
Ibram Kendi, gobbledygook,
and
Robin DiAngelo's just zombified talking points,
and the two people who objected the most were two young women who are mixed race. They said, "My father's not a racist." One was like a Korean and English. The other one was like Filipino and I don't know what else, but an Anglo of some sort. And I think part of what we're seeing on the right is a reaction against that.
For sure.
For being, and then obviously the male-female thing. And if you listen to the statements from Newsom's wife, you would say, "I don't want this person having anything to do with anything." I mean, this is lunatic stuff.
Give me an example. I think I know what you're talking about, but it's been a minute since I saw some clip of her that was unpleasant to be kind.
She would read to her kids, and if she would substitute he and she, and she basically thought that, well, you should be loose in your gender. Why don't you let the goddamn kid decide what gender they are, and kids go through phases of different things. I've had my daughters who go through a tomboy phase, and then they become ultra feminine. Kids do all sorts of crazy stuff. So I mean, and she also did the same thing with race. And so here we have this woman from extraordinary wealth, married into somebody who's been nurtured with extraordinary wealth, talking about class in America and talking about race, and believe me, they're a lot whiter than I am.
So you've got one of the things on the on this culture war front that it's funny to hear you talk about in the 90s a controversial winning bill about don't give taxpayer-funded services to illegal immigrants, which seems like a reasonable policy. Like, why should you come here and start immediately going on the dole?
Right.
Today, Donald Trump in 2024 more or less took the Hispanic vote. And being here in Texas, I know a lot of Mexican.
Well,
I've met a lot of friends in Mexico that are from Mexico, and I barely know any Mexican Democrats, which has been kind of an interesting thing to watch.
It's different in California. There was a significant increase in the Hispanic vote for the Republicans, still about 30%. But when Reagan was running, he was getting 40, 50%. I mean, again, this is a community that has, strong Catholic values, values hard work, involved in what we call the carbon economy. They involved in automobiles and involved in industries that require energy. They have a natural proclivity, I think, to be somewhat more conservative. But, in California, what they've done is, and this is just my impression, is many of the people who are very ambitious go to other places. They move to Texas. They move to Arizona. They move.
So you're left with them bums.
Well, or you're left with the people with PhDs, the most dangerous segment. That's one thing I've been.
That's
thinking.
included in the bums category, by the way.
Right.
Yeah.
The people who are in school for all their lives, basically, and live in a complete fantasy world of writing papers that nobody reads, but they get credit because the papers were published. I mean, I don't know. It doesn't seem to me to be a useful procedure. But I think that this group that grew up in the universities, in particular, in the state bureaucracy, and they are now the powerful. They really run the state. Our next governor is either going to be a sleazy representative of the trade unions or a crazy green. That's sort of our choice.
There was this woman, this heavyset woman, who was truly. Maybe I should restate that. Is that going to be gross to call her a heavyset woman? I don't remember her name. There is a candidate in the Democratic primary for governor in California who was caught on video berating a local reporter for daring to ask questions that involved anything other than "Aren't you wonderful?" And I guess what's
you talking about Katie Porter?
Katie Porter, is that?
Yeah, she used to be my congresswoman.
Apparently broadly understood to be sort of an awful person to everyone around her.
Right. Yeah, she put they allegedly, according to her husband, she poured hot potatoes over his head.
Yeah, just generally great. Somehow these people, I don't know what, it seems like there was this thing called like a political party where you would have people, members, and maybe even structures that would say, hey, you know what? She's a crazy person and probably a criminal, so we shouldn't let her end up running because that would be a bad idea for our party. That seems like that's totally gone.
Well, yeah, California was a place where the party structure collapsed earliest. And it was not just on the Democratic side. I mean, you had you obviously you had Reagan and, really running against the party establishment. So the party structure is really not significant. What's significant is the public unions, most particularly the teachers union.
The worst people on earth.
Well, when you look at LA, they're going to go on strike. And I'm saying, wait a minute, because they want to lay off some people because there are 200,000 less kids in the schools because anybody who can leaves if they have kids. I know it because we moved to Orange County when my daughter was going to 6th grade, and we said, do we want to pay for private school for the next, 7 or 8 years? And I said, no. And we moved to Orange County. We saved a lot of money. And my daughter actually got a decent education. So, I think that this group had just grown. And because of this lopsided economy that we've developed in particularly the last 10 years, with this enormous amount of wealth concentrated in a very small group of people, look, if you have 5 of the 7 wealthiest companies all located in one state, and the people who work in those companies, particularly have been there for a long time, they're worth a fortune. It's not just the billionaires; it's the people who are worth $50 million, $70 million. and many of them also got that money when they were quite young, so they could go and go on to any sort of lunatic cause they wanted to go on. I mean, like this guy Singham, who is funding a lot of the pro-Iranian protests. He's basically allied with the Chinese Communist Party, and he was in the software business. He made a bunch of money, and now he lives in Shanghai. And he
what?
can.
Wait, what's happening? What's happening here exactly? This sounds like foreign interference in elections. What is this?
Well, it's obvious, but the thing is that you have a lot of these people who, whatever their crazy cause was, could give billions and billions of dollars to groups who wanted to ban natural gas, or people like Newsom's wife who want to use the education system to, I guess, erase gender differences or whatever it is that she's interested in. And I think that we really have this takes extreme form in California, because there aren't the, as my brother who lives in New York, he says, New Yorkers never pay for this crap. They just could not possibly. But then I've lost a lot of respect for New York, having electing who I don't even think we would elect Mondani.
Yeah, there's some. So okay, so like I want to the sort of anthropology of the California creature, of the California culture. I guess one thing is California is massive,
right?
So it's an entire seaboard basically,
right?
So on the East Coast, you've got a whole set of states that all have quite distinct identities and cultures, going along the Eastern Seaboard, and in California, you just have California,
right? So
how different are, from your perspective, is it even one state? I know there has been these various fringe efforts to try to break it up into multiple states.
I would say the big distinction should be made between the coastal and the interior. The interior is much more like the rest of the country. There are wealthy people, there are poor people, but there's still a working middle class. A 35-year-old could still buy a house. It's not this sort of neo-feudalism that we have on the coast. Look, where I live in California, even a modest house is going to cost you $1.5 million. Well, how many young people can possibly afford that unless they have rich parents? That's why most of the houses I see are occupied by either inheritors or people whose money comes from overseas.
You've got this culture of the frontier. You've got this reinvention, even Hollywood, like you said, it's like Hollywood was a set of essentially East Coast, mostly Jews that flee to as far away from Thomas Edison as they can, right? Basically,
right.
To start all the studios.
And they had a, in Yiddish we would call the schmata industry mentality.
Yeah, the textile.
We're going to give the public what it wants. Now think about today's Hollywood. It isn't about giving people what they want. It's about giving our class of people something that they find interesting. So you end up with, one battle after another winning the Academy Award. I saw it. My wife said it was so stupid she thought it was a spoof. It was just insanely stupid. If you understood their ideology, that I guess there shouldn't be any border at all. We should just sort of open season. It was this notion of sort of performative radicalism, and where it's okay that your daughter becomes a revolutionary carrying a gun. I don't know. I don't think I'd particularly want that. But I think that, so it's now a very inner focused, and that's why people don't watch the Academy Awards show or anything like that.
Yeah, it was less than 5% of the country watched the Oscars.
And it used to be a national experience. It's the same thing with when you think about the talk shows. Johnny Carson was America from Nebraska. Everybody liked Johnny Carson. Now you've got these little niche players and they have a following. It's a big country, so you can have a progressive audience of 30, 40, 50 million people. So it's not insignificant, but you're not appealing to people in general. I mean, you think about the movies, like Sound of Music or Lawrence of Arabia. I mean, there's nothing like that anymore. The closest you get to it are in the streaming. Occasionally, a series like The Sopranos, one of my favorites. But we don't really see that in the movie industry. It's like everybody wants to be an auteur. Everybody wants to be, sort of thought of as some sort of intellectual giant. But you know what? They wouldn't be the shoelaces on Stanley Kubrick's shoes or Sergei Eisenstein's shoes, or Kurosawa's shoes.
It's funny. I just this weekend went and saw the Hail Mary movie with Ryan Gosling, which I actually really enjoyed. And I was like, oh, this is like, it is sort of funny to just look back at the cultural output of Hollywood. Just if you just have to roll back to like pre-2010.
Right.
And there is a normalcy to the things. It's like, oh, it's like normal expectations of reality. And then, the woke reign of terror kicks in and everything becomes, like you said, just sort of virtue signaling and Mary Sue characters. And there's no real conflict anymore because you have to both have a heroic BIPOC something. And because they're BIPOC something, you can't have them have any internal flaws because, and out goes the hero's journey. If you can't have any internal flaws in your protagonist.
I'm hoping that, maybe the success of that new movie or the success of the Tom Cruise movies, maybe somebody with a quarter of a percentage of intelligence may say, people kind of like this, so why don't we make more of it? Louis B. Mayer would know what to do. Jack Warner would know what to do. He would know you make a product that people like. But there's a kind of arrogance that came into Hollywood. I also think, and I think this is true in culture in general, more MFAs, more people going to school longer as opposed to learning the trade. It's like journalism. Journalism, you do journalism. You don't learn journalism. You learn it by doing it. And my friend Jerry Baker at the Wall Street Journal, somebody asked him once, "What do you do when you get an application for for somebody from the Columbia Journalism School?" He said it goes into the basket.
It's funny. I had Matt Taibbi in the studio last week, and we were talking about this, and he was talking about his parents, and because they were both in TV journalism, and he was sort of reflecting on the fact that journalism was just a working class profession.
It was a craft.
It wasn't a thing that you went to school for. You have to be curious and ask questions and actually burn some shoe leather trying to get to the bottom of what the story is to the best of your ability, and then you move on to the next one, and you don't.
Well, it was very different when I was at the Washington Post many years ago. The guy next to me was an Italian working class guy, a bit of a drunk, but he his brother was a Baltimore cop. These were real people who knew real things. I saw that transition at the Post by the 80s. It was late 70s, early 80s, where there was more filled with PhDs and people who had gone to Harvard. So going to Berkeley was not haute enough. So I think that happened in Hollywood. And by the way, some of the same things happened in Silicon Valley. I interviewed the early guys in Silicon Valley, and this is when it was truly an industrial economy. And it was, by the way, much more egalitarian than what we have now. And these people were, they were college dropouts. They were a lot of Midwesterners like Bob Noyce, people who came from Purdue and places like that. And then the Harvard MBAs came, and it became more and more who went to MIT, who went to Caltech. And and basically Silicon Valley lost touch with reality completely. And
one of the things I've been revisiting the history of Stanford,
right,
because it's partly because I'm doing this project with Schellenberger and Taibbi about their work on the Twitter files. And Stanford.
By the way, have you talked to Jake Siegel?
He's got a new book coming out.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Yeah, I've got a copy of it.
Okay.
But there's what's kind of easy to forget is that Silicon, and I'd be curious how you think about this, because it's challenging some of my own ideological priors in a way. Silicon Valley, going straight back to the founding of Stanford and the whole thing, is just very deeply embedded in the military from the start.
From the start.
That this is what this was. The reason why it is where it is because it was military.
And who was the biggest employer during that time in Silicon Valley? Lockheed Missile and Space.
So you have this thing.
But also NASA.
Yeah. So, but yeah, you have, I mean, you've got the Manhattan Project, but you've got this university heavily funded by the Department of Defense as research for defense. You've got Oracle as a CIA project. I mean, literally, it was a CIA project and it was called Oracle at CIA. And then Larry Ellison leaves and basically gets permission to take the name and turns the CIA into his first client. Google is incubated at Stanford. You've got this close relationship with the military-industrial complex, which is actually kind of weird because that's still very physical and like part of like the sweep of history of militaries. Right. And it's not just super la-di-da ideology.
Right.
But then out of that lineage starts to fade. And then you get into like 60s San Francisco stuff.
Right.
So why does that happen? Why did that change? Why do you have like Packard Bell and IBM and, is it just like sort of, well, Steve Jobs is a hippie and the next generation comes up and they're a bunch of hippies?
Well,
what is it?
I don't think Steve...
I mean, I love Steve Jobs. So
he was
a hippie.
He was also a bit of a jerk, but he was a college dropout. He was an innovator. He was very much in the early stages wanting to build things in California. Steve Wozniak even more so.
Yeah. They built a giant factories. The next computer had giant factories.
Right. I mean, they were true industrialists in that sense, and it got taken over by people who said, well, we can build this thing in China for half the price. Now, eventually, the Chinese, being clever, are going to figure out how to challenge us, and that's certainly what happened. And I think also during the 80s in particular, the Japanese challenge was so severe. People said, well, we got to give up this, we got to give up that. So we stopped making disk drives, we stopped building computers. We started losing all the tactile parts. So Silicon Valley became increasingly divided between a sort of a uber class of high-skilled, highly educated people, and everyone else was kind of a servant. I think one guy at Wired called it a feudalism with better marketing, and it lost that tremendously egalitarian spirit in the sense of people saying, I'm building this company. And then I remember, because I covered all the Silicon Valley, both and in Orange County and in LA, you go and the guys would be very proud. Here's my 500 people, mostly Vietnamese immigrants who are working that I'm providing a good life for. There's none of that now. It's a bunch of overeducated who contract out to companies that pay minimum wages to do all the scut work that needs to be done, and they could give a crap about that. And then on top of that, they're going to be progressives. I mean, the disconnect somehow doesn't get to them. Now, I think part of it is a lot of them are very technical, very engineering oriented, and they don't understand anything. Like, if you ask the top executives in Silicon Valley about the Constitution of the United States, I don't think they would know very much.
That utopianism that you're talking about, that's very much in the culture of the Valley. It has been forever.
Right.
That sense of, I mean, it does go back to the work in the military to some extent, right? It's like you're trying to do the impossible,
Right.
Science and engineering, go to the moon, now go to Mars. We always live in a tension with that. Like you kind of, if you want to have some kind of progress technologically, you need people that are willing to be like,
Right.
I'm going to do this crazy thing that
Right.
everyone says it's impossible, whether you're Edison or Tesla or Jobs or
Sure.
Elon Musk or whatever. Do you think that the like psychology of that type of person just ends up, the warped nature of the kind of person that's willing to
Yes.
think that way has all these other spillover effects? How do you think about that?
Well, I'm the best analysis of that was from Rabbi Sachs, and who was the rabbi of England, the primary rabbi, and he just said people they because they're so good at the technical thing, they look at society the way a technician would look at society. They don't look at it with knowledge of religious values or the historical continuities or literary values. They don't have any of that. And that became more and more clear to me. When I would go and interview like Don Valentine, one of the primary funders of Apple, Don was a history guy, and he was a Italian guy from who went to Fordham and got his degree in chemical engineering and would wear plaid pants. He was that kind of personality. I really liked that personality, and it got replaced by this very elitist worldview and very progressive at the same time. Most of the other ones were at best moderate Republicans, and some of them were far to the right of that. As the Valley became more progressive, it became less egalitarian.
What is it? Is it just that sort of everything's new thing that is at the root of the kind of radical progressivism of California? Is that what it is? Is it that simple?
Yeah, well, and also because you don't have to, since you don't build anything, you don't have to worry about the quality of the California schools. You don't you leave the engineering to the Japanese or the Koreans or the Chinese, basically. So you never develop an affinity for the people on the assembly line. I always contrast that with I had the privilege of being the last journalist to interview Soichiro Honda. And
of the Honda Corporation,
the guy,
yeah,
and
wow.
and he would talk about being on the assembly line. He would go and if he didn't like what was happening, he'd go and take his shirt off and start fixing the assembly line. You don't have those kind of people anymore.
Yeah, is that fair? I mean, when you say that's exactly the kind of person Elon Musk is, I know he gets mocked. He gets mocked for not being enough of an engineer, but everything I've heard that goes deeper on him is like he will go and sleep on the assembly line to get to the bottom of a problem.
And I would also say that, again, going to El Segundo or to Long Beach in these parts of Southern California, all these people who worked for him and are now doing amazing things on their own. Building companies that are doing chemical tests in space or building spaceports. I mean, I go to these companies, and they're my California. That's the part of California I really think is admirable. The other people, the sort of the whole Facebook, Google, I could live without them.
Okay, so you've got this. So that's one part of the mix of California. You've got this sort of hyper concentrated wealth with these companies that are hyperscalers,
Right?
Google, Facebook, the social media companies, and so they've got like zero marginal cost to spread this super viral product and print money with it. But it doesn't. I can't imagine that California's particular flavor of politics has its feet, we can lay at Mark Zuckerberg. Like Gavin Newsom as a creature, is not the result of Mark Zuckerberg and his cohort.
No, but Gavin Newsom as Willie Brown, one of the most talented political figures in the last century in California. He said he's a product of this upper class San Francisco, Silicon Valley. That's his group. He reflects their worldview. I mean, it's one of the reasons why, and I happen to agree with him for practical reasons. He's against the wealth tax that some of the unions are pushing. You know, and I think he makes a good point. If we have a wealth tax, these people will leave and they'll go to someplace else, and then we won't have any more money to do things. I mean, Newsom is many things, but stupid is not one of them. And you know, I think that the problem that we have in California is the publics, the people who are independent have much less power. It's basically the oligarchs and the unions, and they run the state. And historically, the oligarchs were big supporters of all the green stuff. Now that they need to generate power for their AI, there may be a little changing.
Yeah, I with the closing of the Strait of Hormuz from the Iran war, I've been sort of revisiting like the basics of energy. And I mean, California has been on like a mission when it comes to energy. You look at the, I think they're down to like 6 refineries from a peak of 40. They're like importing their oil and gas from abroad.
And we have oil and gas up the gazoo.
Right. So how long can that go on exactly? How long can you run one of the largest economies in the world without the most fundamental element of activity, which is energy? It's like it's the equivalent to food for a human. It's like calories is a measure of energy. We need energy to do everything else, including recharge your electric vehicles, which are now, you know, not as lauded as they used to be, but still.
Well, you know, I think that basically the way I see California being run is that the Greens were very well funded, particularly by not just the oligarchs, but more dangerous than the oligarchs, the ex-wives and widows of the oligarchs, and their children. That's where it really gets screwed up, because these people have no concept of what actually works. Their exposure to the real world is minimal, and they've pushed the green agenda. So you've got the green agenda on one side, which, you know, is an enormous loser if you're middle and working class. I mean, we just passed. They make a big deal. They passed a bill to promote more housing, which they've been doing for 10 years, no immediate effect. And then they turn around and they say, well, we're going to put a tax on you if you live in an area where people take a car to work. Well, only 3% of Californians take transit to work. So, I mean, why would you do this? So what it means is the working class guy in Riverside, who's probably Hispanic, who maybe wants to own a little house in Riverside, who has to drive in an F-150 to Long Beach for working on a project, that person is screwed. If you're an oligarch, it doesn't matter to you, and it doesn't matter to you if you're a school teacher. What you want is more and more money for doing less and less. I mean, that's basically the equation.
One of the things that's happened sort of to the economy as a whole, and maybe it's even anthropological, like with this post-industrial revolution, the explosion in wealth in the society, is you have a larger and larger share of, like, let's say, total income going to these areas that are functionally state monopolies that you're mentioning: healthcare and education, and school. Let's say school, right, rather than education. Education suggests there's learning towards some end that's useful. School, school, and healthcare, and that makes sense, because if you think about, like, well, you've got basics taken care of, you can get calories in your body, you live relative safety. So you're basically living in what, like, prior generations of humans would say the lap of luxury. What are you going to do with all this extra time on your hands? You're going to, I guess, go to school and take care of that little thing going on with your knee that's been bothering you.
Right.
You're going to dump an endless amount of money into chronic health issues and all the like. That does create some of the dynamics you're talking about, where like robots are building all the stuff. So what are all people doing? We're in these service sectors. A lot of them are just these sort of government-run monopolies.
Well, then that's the danger. I was just in Italy for a month, and that's what the Italian economy is. People work for the government. And who own property. Those are the only two things that are going on. There isn't this sort of huge entrepreneurial thing that's going on. But I think that people make a mistake when they say, well, in the AI universe, we're not going to need people. I think there are going to be a lot of needs that are going to be necessary. We're still going to have to build stuff. We're a long way from building robots who can do plumbing. There's a great desire for small scale production on the consumer side. I think there are opportunities out there. What really I find very disturbing is the tendency of the oligarchs and their paid marionettes to say, oh, well, everything's going to be great. You're not going to have to work. We'll all be living off Apple computer profits, and we'll do nothing. I think it's a destructive, and you know what? There are plenty of people in the world who have to work and will want to work, and if you're not going to work, they're going to eat your lunch, and that's exactly what's going to happen. This lack of discipline, this lack of saying, I'm going to learn a skill that's actually going to make a living. That wiping that out is absolutely dangerous. And again, it ties into this utopian idea. I remember Nancy Pelosi once saying, oh, in the future, everyone will do what they love. Well, you know what? I don't think so. I think we're not all going to become opera singers. This lack of any tactile reality is a huge problem, and it's very particularly a problem in California.
We have like you said, in Gavin Newsom, sort of an avatar for a type.
Right.
So because he, as I understand his past, at least part of it involves his father being a lawyer to the Getty, the Getty folks, as in Getty Oil,
right?
Which is always it's like, okay, you won't refine any oil for all of the cars that are driving around Los Angeles at 2 miles an hour on the I-10, but this was your whole upbringing. What exactly is he? You've written this at length, but like, how should I honestly think about what Gavin Newsom is? We have a president in Donald Trump who himself is an enigmatic, crazy character.
Right.
But Newsom's a crazy character in all kinds of different ways.
Very different ways. One, he's, though like Trump, he grew up on third base, because he came, if not directly money, he was sponsored by the Gettys throughout his career. But I think he's a combination of that kind of sort of noblesse oblige approach of that class of people. And also
what do you mean by that for those who are not familiar with that phrase?
Well, we have to take care of the poor. We have to, that's our obligation. The middle class, they're vulgarians anyway. So there's always been that upstairs, downstairs kind of politics, which is very, very obvious in San Francisco and obviously something that we see in the state. And then there's the politician who realizes that the public employee unions are the most powerful organized force in the state, and you have to accommodate them. Now, the difference between Newsom and those who are likely to follow him is they will be even less able to say no. Jerry Brown could say no more than Newsom, and the guys who follow Newsom will be even less likely. I mean, sometimes I think, like, why don't we just have the teachers union run the government and cut out the middleman?
I mean, I think that it's close enough to that right now, right? But he seems like, on at least on several metrics, to have failed his way up. Is that fair? So, I mean, what I mean by that is he was mayor of San Francisco. San Francisco has a massive homelessness and basically open air drug market catastrophic problem.
Right.
He had been talking about solving it and to the tune of billions of dollars during his whole mayorship. And by every metric, it got worse. He rises out of that disaster, taking sort of one of the most beautiful cities in the country and literally covering it in human feces, to then be the governor, multiple terms, and you have trains to multi-hundred billion trains to nowhere, collapse of the energy sector, rapid exit of some of these companies like SpaceX and Tesla and more and more and more and more. Like, how is that not total failure of governance?
Well, because from the measurement of GDP, based on the handful of companies, California is a big economy, and and maybe its gross GDP grows faster than other places, because you've got 4 or 5 companies that are essentially monopolies, and make fantastic amounts of money. You have a large class of people who came in the 60s and 70s and did really well. So you've got that class as well. And you have control over certainly the entertainment industry, a lot of the cultural industry, and up until recently, the news business. Now, the news business is changing. You don't have the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, ABC, CBS, NBC domination that you used to have. So you're now getting some more dissent in the news. So Newsom won't get uniformly good coverage. But from the big media, I mean, if you read Politico, I mean, how much do they write about all the scandals around Newsom? How come they don't write about the highest cost-adjusted poverty rate in the country? Why is not talk about the highest youth unemployment rate? Why do they talk about miserable performance at schools when you judge it by how many dollars? It's pathetic. Who's going to raise those issues? And then so Newsom goes off. He's going to hire a New York ad agency to show how great it is. And his excuses, well, all the attacks on California are politically motivated by, right-wing extremists. Okay. I'm not a right-wing extremist. My colleague Jennifer Hernandez is not a right-wing extremist. None of us are Republicans. But the spin, works endlessly. The idiot East Coast reporter comes to California, goes to nice places, is treated to a wonderful meal with great wine, and thinks how great California is.
One of the things that has gotten a fair amount of recognition about California, and even Newsom himself has sort of talked about it, not really done anything meaningful, but talked about it, is, there is that $100 billion train to nowhere. And among the reasons is it is literally impossible to build anything in that state. The regulatory environment, the environment, every Tom, Dick, and Harry that wants to challenge you because there's an owl somewhere at some point can stop your project, whether it's your own home or something big like a train.
Is done, for the construction unions. That seems to be a big motivation. It was an idiotic project from the beginning. Those who do not understand the geography of California, the major part of the population of California lives near the coast, on what we would call the 101 corridor. That's where the existing trains are. We could have updated those trains, maybe got them to 100 miles an hour. And the tourist would like it. No tourist is going to want to go on a train that goes through the Central Valley. I spent a lot of time in the Central Valley, and there are a lot of nice things about it. Scenic is not. And if you're a tourist, or if I could go to San Francisco in 4 hours by train. Well, we figure all the problems with plane travel, it might be worthwhile. But no, they didn't fix that. They wanted to build a boondoggle that would employ people, that people would make money with, and the state is miserably run. It's not just the choo-choo to nowhere. It's on the roads. We have among the worst quality roads in the country. Our infrastructure is clearly in bad shape. I mean,
you really don't have any excuse on the roads front because you don't get snow.
Right.
It's like the thing that destroys roads more than anything else is snow.
Yeah.
And then plowing the snow and banging up the roads with it, laying
also,
salt and all the rest of it.
If you have a state whose ideology is cars are bad and people should take the bus to work, then you don't want to put money into the roads because that might encourage them. I mean, it's the whole notion of what this planning group that comes out of academia, out of this dream world that I described before. They just live in this. You sit there and say, really, people. You think people want to live in 2-bedroom apartments that cost $4,000 a month in a crappy neighborhood where they couldn't send their kids to school? I don't think so. But you're going to push that and push it. So what you end up with is an electorate that's made up of childless people. There's been a big drop in the birth rate. Childless people who are basically lifetime renters. Voters for the Democratic Party is what that turns out to be.
Yeah, there's been a lot written more broadly about the sort of big sort that's going on for at least a couple decades.
Right.
Of if you're conservative or Republican or whatever, you're not on the radical left. If you have a small business, you're going to come to Texas. You're going to go to Tennessee or Florida or anywhere else.
Right.
And so you end up with blue states getting bluer and red states getting redder.
Right.
And on the economic front, the red states end up doing better. The red state populations are growing because just on average, it's just generally going to be better economic policy for whatever reason, frankly. I mean, I know why ideologically I believe that's true, but I think it's empirically true. And the population growth numbers tell almost all the story I would think you would need to think about, like, well, where do you want to go? Where people are going or people are leaving?
Well, I think it depends, what stage of life you're at, who you are. If I'm a AI engineer who graduated from MIT, it might make sense to go to California. Sure. If I want to get involved in space, well, now I can go to Texas as well or to Florida. But, maybe it's worth it. It depends who you are. In the small business world, if it wasn't for the immigrants, there just wouldn't be hardly anything, because the immigrants are willing to take more pain to get some gain than the average American is willing to.
There's been Chris Rufo just did some reporting about the scope of fraud in California's Medicaid and welfare state programs. Nick Shirley, the YouTuber, has been shining a light on this stuff. How do you understand the scope of fraud going on in California in particular?
Well, I think I want to say I'm not surprised because you've had a one-party system. It's sort of like corruption in the Soviet Union. I think there was probably a good deal of it. You have an unmovable group of people who don't have to really listen to the voters because it's a one-party state. I mean, one of the reasons we moved from L.A., I lived in L.A. for over 40 years, so I think I did my time. One of the reasons we moved to Orange County is there's a two-party system in Orange County. There are Democrats, and they have to be more moderate to win, and there are Republicans, and they have to be more moderate to win. They have to solve the problems. You take a look at the city and even now the county of Los Angeles. There's nobody there who's going to blow the whistle. And the problem is the economic base of the Democratic Party in particular is the government corruption machine itself. It's not all that different from Chicago. The only difference is there's more money to steal.
One of the things that I had a friend, sort of scholar at the Cato Institute, Michael Cannon, come on, and it was sort of right in the middle of the Somali news cycle. And one of the things he pointed out was, look, sure, the Somalis are just stealing like crazy, but they're not actually even stealing that much relative just to the broader scope of theft throughout the system.
I mean, they're underperforming.
Like they're not even. They might. Yeah. I mean, they're a small but mighty population on the corruption front. But at the heart of it, it seems like that this notion of the sort of the welfare state,
Right.
one would think that would be paired with some notion of, I want the government to be good at this stuff.
Well,
But instead, it just seems like it's pure payola. It's like we can't have any of these programs have any amount of friction to getting access. Access is this like progressive buzzword. So if there's something like identity checks on anything at all, like the way American Express does to make sure nobody's running your card at the gas station and then going and getting a steak dinner tonight, well, that might prevent someone from not getting access to this welfare state. So we shouldn't have any of that. And Ilhan Omar even said as much. She's like, well, it's just so easy to take the money. You can't blame them for taking it.
well, I think you can blame them, but I particularly
morally, but
it's some of it is my money, so I'll oppose that. But the important thing is that there's no check and balance. You can be as corrupt as you want. I mean, look, they could show that under Gavin Newsom, some hundreds of millions of dollars, even billions of dollars was spent illegally. It's not going to make a difference. You know, the next guys who come in are going to be conceivably even worse. So, I mean, you look at the city of Los Angeles, we have a mayor who is a complete failure, and by any stretch of the imagination.
Still Karen Bass. Yeah.
Who was in the Venceremos Brigade, and her opposition is
literally radical communist.
and her opposition is from the left. I mean, she's going to end up being the moderate candidate. I mean, that's how far our politics have evolved, particularly in the urban centers.
What has driven, what is the actual feedback loop of increasingly radical politics? Like, what is the washing machine that each generation, it's like, now it's like, no. Castro was a conservative. Like, we're into the Castro was a conservative part of the cycle now.
Well, I think what happens is, you know, I compare. I once wrote a piece, said, you know, describing Newsom as Juan Newsom, Ron Perón. Yeah. You give away, you know, Argentina was a very rich country. Yeah. You give away to these constituencies, and they support you. So, you know, that's become part of the way the system works. And so what happens is who stays and who goes. Right? Who stays are the older people who already got their homes and their kids were educated when the schools were functional.
They bought their home long enough ago that their real estate taxes are incredibly low because of the Prop, whatever it was, I forget.
13.
Prop 13.
I bought my first house in Hollywood for $150,000. So I think one of the things is you've got the older people, many of whom were very liberal, who, because they tend to stay. I mean, I have people in my synagogue, I talked to them, I said, what planet are you living on? You know, but, you know, they're 75 years old and their house is worth $3 million and, you know, things are good for them. And their kids are, you know, mostly not living in California anymore. But then, so you've got that group. Then you've got this huge public employee group. And then you've got the people who are government dependent with income transfers. So the people who are young, ambitious, young families, they're the ones who are leaving. The people leaving increasingly are 35 to 54, make about $100,000 a year.
I mean, that's like the dead center of the prime of your life. That's right. The prime of your life. You get into your mid-30s, you've got a decade of work under your belt. Maybe you're in the industry that you feel like you now are good at. and it's like 50 to 60 is like super prime. Now you really know what the hell you're doing, and unless you get displaced totally, this is going to be your prime time earning years. They're leaving. They're out.
Right, and that's why our fertility rate has dropped dramatically. We've got all those statistics, and like if you're a young, ambitious, and it doesn't matter what race you are, young, ambitious, anything, and you're 35 years old, you're making $130,000 a year as a family, maybe more, and you can't buy a house, and you're heavily taxed. And what do you say? Well, if I move to Texas or I move even to Arizona or to Nevada, I'm going to be a lot better off. And one of the interesting things that's happening is there used to be a premium if you worked in New York or California. Now that doesn't exist anymore, or it certainly doesn't exist to a large extent. I mean, why do companies not hiring in California? Because if you offer somebody a job in California that pays $150,000 a year, then how big, how much cardboard am I going to get for my house? I mean, it's. So what we're doing is we're losing that population. So electorally, the people who might have voted for moderate Democrats or voted for Republicans, they're gone, and the people who are staying are the ones who are going to vote for the crazy stuff, and that's the way it works. You begin to select for a certain type of person, and then you get a certain kind of result.
So the thing that's hard to understand about this is that most of the country is not that radical. We're a center to maybe center-right country.
I agree.
Certainly Europeans would see it that way. They think our left is the right. And yet, we already had a preview of this in the form of the 2024 election, in which you had Donald Trump, who there was a bunch of things that set that up to be completely bizarre, right? We don't need to rehash all of them. But Kamala Harris, who is like the worst candidate, it's like if I'm going to have a lab experiment to concoct the worst possible presidential candidate, like no capabilities, can't string a sentence together, like provably sort of slept her way into office. Right. Like just.
Well, we could be more graphic than that, but we won't.
There wasn't much sleeping going on, let's say. But like it, like just out, and then you get like a clown from a lunatic state as your VP. They didn't lose by that much.
No.
So
part of it is Trump.
Sure.
I mean,
I guess that maybe
if they had nominated a regular human being, even marginally DeSantis or Nikki Haley or. They'd
all be all those people would be called Nazis, by the way, still.
But it doesn't matter. But Trump is his own worst enemy. He always has been. But I would turn it around and say, how could you have lost to Donald Trump? This guy who was clearly imbecilic in some areas, no self-control. Just irrational. I refer to him as Dr. Demento.
I like Trump more than you, Joel. That's okay.
Well, right, but
fair.
But
he's a crazy character. I think objectively.
But relative to Kamala Harris, enough people said she can't be president. I mean, and then she runs with that idiot Waltz. I mean, it's just like there was no hope. And look, compared to Kamala Harris, Gavin Newsom is an attractive candidate. He can't put a sentence together.
He can, technically. So I guess the question below the surface is, when you look at the country writ large, it doesn't. Like, where's the reasonable people? Because you have are we really going to end up with Californians in the highest? It's bizarre. Like, where's like the governor from some normal state that's not California to come along and be president?
Well, the last,
because it seems like we don't know. We're sitting here. 2026.
The last Democrat I supported was Bill Clinton. He was the governor of Arkansas.
Today he'd be like considered a conservative Republican.
I mean, and probably Jimmy Carter would also be considered a conservative Republican in many ways. I mean, the Democrats used to nominate, people who had some connection to the rest of the population, and now they're going to nominate. I mean, you think about the choices. Pete Buttigieg. I mean, if Pete Buttigieg was straight, nobody would even talk about him.
This is true.
His
only credential is being gay, which is not a credential.
Right. I have no problem with a gay president. I just think that there'd be something else, please. So I think that what's happened is the country has been dumbed down, maybe dumbed down enough to elect Gavin Newsom as president.
This is the H.L. Mencken. Like, to paraphrase, it's like, at some point democracy will be so perfected that we'll have a complete imbecile in the White House, something like that.
Well, we've been managing. We had a senile old man in the White House, and now we have a lunatic in the White House. I mean, it's like, yeah, and the lunatic may be an improvement. I mean, this is the country that produced Abraham Lincoln and George Washington and Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower. I mean, these were reasonably important people who were relatively sane.
What are the best things you could say about Gavin Newsom? To some extent, to play devil's advocate for a second here, because I'm a right of center guy. I voted for Trump. I'm obviously biased. He's been handed a deck of cards as governor in the single party state. He would say, I think, look, a lot of the things that you complain about California, I complain about. I can only do the things that I am able to do within the scope of my control as governor, which frankly isn't really as much. And if I'm in behind closed doors, I hate these friggin' teachers unions too, brother. Like if I was gonna be like the best version of Gavin
I send my kids to private school.
Yeah, that's the conversation at the French Laundry in the middle of COVID he's having. But
here's what I would say in favor of Newsom. He's flexible. Like for instance, when the Greens wanted to shut down the refinery, all the remaining refineries,
and the last nuclear power plant also,
and his aide said, "This is fairy dust. This is ridiculous." There have been certain areas where Newsom says, oh, "No, this is too much." I'll say that for him. Now, where he may be better than a Biden is Biden was so out of it that he had no idea what was going on, and he let his lunatic aides run everything. Yeah. So I think
the cross-dressing suitcase snatchers were running the Biden administration.
Right, there's something like
literally.
That. I mean, again, I would say the one thing I say, he's intelligent and he works hard, and he has a certain degree of flexibility. That, compared to Kamala Harris, she is a nothing. She can't put together a sentence. Newsom is an improvement over her. And Newsom is probably an improvement over Joe Biden because Joe Biden was out of it. I think that and I don't think he has the arrogance that Obama had.
What do you mean by that?
Obama thought he knew everything. He was, I'm a better speechwriter than my speechwriter. I'm a better strategist than my strategist. That kind of unbelievable hubris that was very much part of the Obama personality. But I certainly don't think he should become president. But I think that if we end up with a choice between him and AOC, I think I'd rather have Newsom.
So would I. Oh man. I mean, I guess technically that choice would come before the general, but why? Do you think that there's a chance for the center to be restored in our politics?
Boy, that's a hard question. Again, as each of the states become redder and bluer, where does that person come from? I mean, I can think of right now in the Democratic Party, two, Beshear in Kentucky and Shapiro in Pennsylvania. Those are the only two I could even think about Now, there may be others. There was the guy who was the governor of North Carolina, more centrist Democrats. In the Republican Party, I think right now they'd be lucky if they nominated Rubio. I know J.D. Vance, and I think he's consumed by ambition. And anybody who has a Tucker Carlson son working for him, I'm not going to support.
In our last conversation, you had beat up on Tucker, which at the time I didn't. Since that conversation, lots of things have happened with Tucker that have made it a little clearer, kind of where he's at on different things. I don't know what to make of a lot of that. the going to places like Saudi Arabia and talking about like how good it, like, hey, I'm Christian, I'm here, I'm fine. It's like Christianity is illegal in that country,
right?
So I don't really know.
Well, and also, I'm saying, sure, societies with Sharia law are more advanced. I'm saying, really? I mean, I happen to work a lot with Iranians, Iranian Muslims, and none of them would say that Sharia law is what they want. I know what it's like to live in Iran from what they tell me, and I wouldn't particularly think it's a great thing.
I'm curious how you what you think about this Iran war from a couple different angles. Just your lifetime of reporting. You're also in an area where like the Los Angeles area has a pretty large Iranian expat population,
the largest in the country by far.
Yeah. So give me from both of those from your own perspective, what do you make of this thing? Because I'm like personally been on like from the start sort of on the 51-yard line in favor, which is kind of against type for me. I'm a more Ron Paulish kind of guy in general.
Okay. Well, first of all, the Iranian regime was extremely aggressive and was murdering Americans. They were a global threat on eventually on the level of a Nazi Germany. That, because with the technology that now exists, I mean, how many years was it going to be until they had a nuclear bomb that they could put on a long-range missile? 10 years? 5 years? With people who literally don't care what happens afterwards. So certainly it was a challenge. First of all, how Trump says things, I don't like at all. I also think that a much smarter alternative would have been to secure or blockade the Carg Island. They would have shut down their economy without having to, shut out the lights in every place in Iran. And I think there should be much more emphasis on trying to arm the civilians in Iran to overthrow their own government. I think that I can tell you there are very few people who support that government. But if we go in and destroy their infrastructure that affects all the civilians, I think it might not turn out so well.
So as we sit here, he hasn't bombed the essential infrastructure of the society yet. Play out your thinking with this for me more. I just want to hear other perspectives on this because it's so difficult to know anything.
Okay, well, just so you know, we're just finishing at Chapman a study of Persian Americans, so I've got some data. I mean, first of all, I think that we should be looking at how to undermine that regime one way or another, whether it's finding somebody in the regime who's willing to make some sort of deal. I think that has to happen. As far as Hormuz is concerned, long term, the United States of America becomes more powerful because Europe will and lots of Asia will basically evaporate. I mean, Trump is right that the Europeans and the Japanese and should be there. Even the Chinese should be there to stop them from closing the straits, but they're not going to be. But again, I think he didn't do the work that should have been done before, which let's say someone like George H.W. Bush would have done. getting his alliances together, figuring out how to make it work. I know that regime has to be taken out one way or another, either weakened significantly for all sorts of reasons. I mean, my own assistant is Iranian, and she was in Tehran, and her hijab wasn't on right, and she was taken out and whipped. Okay, a regime like that doesn't deserve to exist.
One of the things you're quick to vocalize your displeasure for Trump, his way and whatnot, and I understand that, and I agree with a fair amount of it. Like he literally on I think Easter Sunday.
Yeah, I know that was
like posts like with the F-bomb, open the street, you crazy, and then like. Praise be Allah. It was like that. There's these moments of just like utter madness that I think no matter how much of a fan of the president you are, you have to admit like that's madness. Like what is that?
Right.
I think I have two things about the president that I find interesting. One is, as an East Coast guy, his way, I'm less off. I kind of like I have family members like this kind of like him.
I grew up on the border of Queens, so
so this guy, who he like.
Yeah, if you were in a bar, this is what the guys would be talking about, even though Trump doesn't drink.
No, not at all. But the other piece of it what the hell do I know about this really? Like the political animal thing of him is interesting to me because. On several different issues, he has done the thing that had been talked about, never acted on.
Right. No, I agree.
Forever. And like, that's kind of amazing. Like, he moved every president since at least Jimmy Carter said they were going to move our embassy to Jerusalem. He actually just does it.
Right.
And then like nothing happens. He just does it and everyone's like, it's going to be World War III. No, not World War III. This Maduro thing is nuts, but Maduro actually, like, I think the Biden administration actually put out like a warrant for his arrest.
Right.
So it isn't like it just was out of nowhere.
Or putting the screws on Cuba, which was so vulnerable.
He's just like, we're going to take it. We're just going to take it. It's like, but I mean, couldn't you, make the strongest case for Trump as someone who like is clearly like revolted by his manner.
Well, I think first of all, I think that he understands how to put pressure on people. He's generally, at least so far, managed to do a lot without exposing huge numbers of U.S. troops. He's not, he's into regime change, but he's not into turning them into democracies.
He's a realist on that.
He's a realist. I think that's true, and I think he's in favor of strengthening the military, which I think we do. I have this essay coming out on how America is Rome, and the world is a screwed up place. But the only way you're going to have prosperity is you have to have, and global prosperity is you have to have an empire that can enforce things. And, the Romans did that. The British did it for 2 centuries, and we're doing it now. What's going to be in a world where Starmer and Macron are calling the shots? I mean, you might as well, you might as well hand
Islamic law
or the Chinese Communist Party or Putin. I mean, so I think that Trump is, I described him in one piece as a necessary enema. Something had to happen. Even I remember a good friend of mine who's a Portland area, brought up in Portland, a big liberal. And I remember we were at a Chinese restaurant, and he said to me, I can't stand Trump, but he said it was necessary. We couldn't keep going the way we were going, And I always have this discussion even with my wife. She hates Trump, and I said, would you want Kamala Harris there? I couldn't vote for Kamala Harris. I said, she's an imbecile. There's no way she should be remotely close to power.
No.
Yeah. I mean, no.
Manifestly true.
And now the problem is, again, I don't like Trump, but I think he was willing, as you pointed out, to do things that no one else would do. He would, and I think even with the military, I mean, I don't like Hegseth, and I think his religious ideology is nauseating to the extreme.
How do you understand what that is? That's a strong statement. So what exactly are you talking about? He
belongs to a church that's led by a guy who thinks that over time that women maybe shouldn't vote, and that only Christians should serve in office. We're a country which has got a lot of people who aren't Christians. And, it's a complete violation of what the United States is about. You go back to George Washington, you could do that.
This is Doug Wilson. I've actually had Doug Wilson, Pastor Doug Wilson. I'm Catholic, so all this Protestant and evangelical stuff, I don't fully understand, like what it takes to be a pastor and whatnot, but I think he's a pastor. He's an affable guy. We had a conversation that actually went kind of viral because I said, well, 250 years from now, you've got your version of Christian nationalism. What does it mean? And rather than go to like Islam or Judaism or Hindu, I was like, okay, so I'm Catholic. Like, he's like, well, you couldn't, so Catholic. So you could have church bells in the public square, like Catholic church bells, that's fine. You couldn't like have a procession with the Virgin Mother, with Mary.
Why?
And I said, well, what about like the Eucharist? Can't do that? He's like, nah, that's idol worship. And I'm like, the first 1,500 years of Christianity was only this, right? You realize like your like new stuff is new. Yeah, it's interesting.
I mean, so, but on the other hand, the idea of making the military more, using AI, getting rid of the attempts to get people to be re-educated, to be anti-racist. That had to stop. So I mean, on a lot of levels, Trump has done what had to be done. I wish it was done by somebody else. I wish it was done better. One of my biggest fears is that the way he does things will discredit even the good things that he did.
One of the things that I think is hard about this, I'm curious how you think about this. Like, you have this feedback loop of consensus,
right?
And you talk and you write a lot about class. We've talked about it in this conversation. You have, and this is a new way of thinking for me as somebody who's always been quite libertarian oriented, and so class isn't like a way of thinking, class analysis.
Right.
It sounds kind of like Marxist.
Well,
but groups of people.
Weber, you could take Weber, you could talk Tocqueville, you can talk all sorts. The issue of class existed well before Karl Marx.
So and I think the notion that you have ways of thinking that then become like a groupthink type of circumstance. You see this sort of post-war, the so-called post-war consensus, and like Emmanuel Macron is maybe the international poster child of this kind of statesman that's slick and that knows how to say the triangulated thing that doesn't is sort of inoffensive, but whatever. And then when that is literally virtually everyone, it's hard to imagine that you're going to have someone shy of like a fictional superhero that has the chutzpah to go at some of this stuff and isn't also kind of crazy, because it doesn't seem like this is true of the Silicon Valley people too. Like I think Steve Jobs was like a difficult person.
Oh, he was a jerk.
But he
was
made
brilliant.
demands of reality. He bent reality in a very real sense. And it just doesn't seem like humans tend to come as like this thing that can both bust through really hard walls and be made of steel, and then also be genteel and be. But maybe I'm like a product of my age, and that we had these great statesmen before that were like tough as nails and also had gravitas.
The Roosevelts, Truman, Eisenhower. These were all great men. I think we could have approached these things in a better way. I mean, I think about I was involved with the Democratic Leadership Council when Clinton was the head of it, and he would take on the teachers' unions. He would take on the race industry. He would take on the sort of feather bedding among the unions. I mean, and now Clinton was a complicated and deeply flawed person as well, not in the way that Trump is deeply flawed, although they may.
Well, in some ways.
Yeah, they had some
Well,
common
they both like
interest.
women a lot.
Right, which is nothing wrong with that, but
Yeah, something's wrong with some of it.
yeah, well, you certainly. I like women a lot, but it basically starts and ends with my wife. But the issue, I think, is that these times are not producing I think this is what your point is, the kind of statesperson who can be both tackle the tough problems and be a decent human being. We don't seem to be able to create that kind of persona in the world today.
Why do you think that is? Before we started rolling, and maybe this is part of it, or maybe it's just a different problem. You were talking about how your interest in teaching was waning. And one of the reasons why you said was that there's not enough curious, engaged students. It's
Right.
like 5 out of 50.
And most of my colleagues would say the same thing.
So-
I have to say, in the business school, now that I'm teaching in the business school, it's better than it was before.
But what's your diagnosis of the shift in the culture and like the norms, the median?
I think our expectations of people have dropped too much. When I first started teaching, we would do, let's say I had a class, I'd have 7 books to read. Now, if I have 3 and I know they're not going to get read, okay, that's when I went to school. Sometimes I had a good professor, sometimes I didn't, but no matter what, the books were great. Reading, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard all had its value. That I can't remember the names of the teachers, but I remember the names of the books. That, I think, is what's really missing. And I'm hoping that, I know a lot of my colleagues at Chapman in particular, and I think at Civitas as well, are trying to bring back that. It is so exciting when you have a student who's engaged, who's asking you questions. What else can I read about this? But I find much less of that than I did. I hope that maybe this Gen Z generation is going to turn that around. I don't know. The technological forces are giving them so many easy outs. And also one of the problems is that my parents were from the Depression and were readers, particularly my father. Yeah. How many of these kids grow up in a house with no books? How many of them, they have big screen TVs and no libraries?
Now, can you connect the dots from this sort of deculture, what would the word be? I want to say like something like denaturing, but with culture. Is there something there that is part of what's making our politics and leadership so coarse?
Yes, because whether it's work experience where you perfect a craft and you learn something about discipline and values, or if you read, you have ability to think for yourself. I spent the last month interviewing artisans in Italy. I mean, a remarkable group of people. And yeah, most of them didn't go to college or anything like that, but they had a sensibility of this looks good, and I have a skill that I'm going to learn. I was in a jewelry business in Florence, and there were 3 young women learning how to make jewelry. That kind of understanding is just as important as the intellectual understanding. Now, I'm more comfortable with books because I'm basically all thumbs, and I can barely install a light bulb. But the idea of learning how to think for yourself and to understand that there are when somebody says, Kamala Harris is a communist. That's first of all, I think that's an insult to communism, and she's not intelligent enough to be a communist. She would never have gotten through Marxism, Leninism, or when somebody says Donald Trump is a fascist. I said, do you know what fascism is? I mean, I'm working on that right now, and and when you go to Italy and you interview people whose families were fascist, and you talk to historians of Italy, you get a much more sophisticated view of what fascism is. So the problem is that we don't,
And communists, especially if you're in Tuscany.
right, right, but for sure,
Super red, beautiful rolling hills and lots of reds. I was. This is going to sound like the most elitist thing ever. I'm sorry, viewers, but I did a hike from Florence to Rome. I'm Italian. It was a group thing. It was a vacation, and we stopped in this little town and got some incredible food. And I see a little Blessed Mother grotto in this wall, and I'm looking at it, admiring it. And this bald priest that looks like Friar Tuck comes out, and he's like, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from Texas." He's like, "Oh, Texas, that's great." And then we talked for a little bit. His English was pretty good. And then he offhand was like, "Well, yeah, we're in Tuscany. It's nothing but communists here." So even now, even in 2024,
but even the Italian communists are a better breed than ours. But I think that this lack of knowledge is very and knowledge of history. I mean, I've had classes where the kids didn't know who was on our side in World War II. I mean, and I don't blame the kids. I blame the teachers and I blame the parents. The kids, I mean, I find that kids want to know things. I think they naturally want to know things. But by the time they're a junior and senior in college and they don't know the most basic things, like I remember one student saying to me, the Electoral College was designed to protect slavery. And I said, really? What state really pushed for the Electoral College? It was Connecticut. Connecticut was a free state. So was Rhode Island. I mean, it was about small states and big states. It was nothing to do with slavery. I mean, New York didn't want the Electoral College, and neither did Virginia, because those were the big states. And yet I know that this is what they're taught in school. I had another student who she was a very bright student, and she said, well, she did her presentation on how Western capitalism created sexism, and I said, have you ever been to the Middle East? Have you ever been to China? Have you ever been to Japan? You think the very idea of feminism emerged out of a liberal capitalist environment.
I have a question about actually sort of that thread. That's sort of when we look at sort of the way there's a bunch of themes in our conversation. One of which is sort of polarization. Deep blue California versus deep red Texas, let's say. And the way in which that's pulling us apart. I think one other thing that has been the most challenging thing for me to try to think about is that we have these freedoms in this society. Chief among them is the freedom of expression and faith, of freedom of conscience. The First Amendment, freedom of association, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, religious practice. And that has given rise to a kind of you could say libertine culture that
California ideology.
Right? So it made California in some ways is almost maybe the peak of that sort of you do you kind of freedom.
Right.
Now, when it comes to what the role of government, I'm super libertarian. I'm as libertarian as they get. But when I think about culture, and I look at the things that have happened in the past 5 to 10 years in particular, I have become more and more worried that freedom is not enough. That freedom, absent other norms that are healthy for the human creature, ends up just being a giant playground with which to kill yourself.
I agree. I mean, all the ancient philosophers, and would have made that same point, which is if you're going to have freedom, you have to have a sense of responsibility. You have to know what the limits of on behavior are. That doesn't mean that the state should necessarily tell you to do that, but there should be a limit. Like, for instance, when Donald Trump uses the F word, ranting and raving
on Easter weekend, of all times,
isn't there some force saying, maybe I can make the same points without that? And I think that in the book I'm working on now, I'm one of the things I'm talking about is politics is kind of irrelevant. The forces of technology and demography are infinitely more powerful, and that if we want a good society, we have to have good people. We can't have a good society. Oh, well, we can't the great fault of the left in particular, but also some parts of the right is, well, if we have this legislation, we'll be a good society. No, I mean,
where are the angels that will enforce this beautiful legislation? First of all,
and of course they're going to have their own interests. I mean, like in the USSR, when within a year or two of the revolution, the Bolsheviks were living in the palaces of the aristocracy.
Animal Farm had a purpose,
right? So I think that this idea that there's some sort of moral constraints, and I think it starts at very base in the family. If we don't solve the problem of the family, everything else is irrelevant.
Do you see any sources for hope and optimism on a renewal of that foundation?
Yeah, actually, I was on a podcast with John Kasich this morning. We're talking about that, and
blast from the past.
I know. Very interesting. Anyway, so one of the things is there a religious revival? Not in numbers. It's maybe not losing ground, but what's interesting is that people who are becoming religious are increasingly from the educated classes. They're increasingly, even some scientists, but also that otherwise people are beginning to realize that religious attitudes are very important if you're going to succeed in life. My colleague that I wrote this report with is from South Africa. His name is Becky Malobo. And, we started looking at the numbers. Nigerian Christians do better than Nigerian Muslims, do better than Nigerian animists.
You mean in Nigeria?
In Nigeria. Then
that tracks.
And what we're also seeing is increasingly the people who are religious and also the people who are having children are increasingly from the educated classes. So we're getting to see where it used to be the religious people were the poor didn't know any better, and then they were the ones who had kids. Even the word proletarian starts from having children. What's really interesting to me is that we're seeing among classes that were completely secular a greater respect for religion, and I also think that there's a mindset among many younger people, including many younger women, who understand that having children is the purpose of life, the most important purpose of life. I mean, when you get to my age and your friends starting to die off, and I say, well, one of my closest friends died off, but his two sons are living his life, continuing his legacy. That's like I hope my daughters will. And I think that sense of family, the sense of religion, the sense of community, you don't have to have children. You could have some other kind of affiliation. But this sort of this nihilistic, atomized existence is really the problem. It's not Donald Trump and it's not Gavin Newsom. The problem is something much deeper than that. And I think that's the only way to deal with the future is how do we bring those values back? How do you understand what really matters and what really doesn't matter? and the family unit, the local community. I mean, I've seen even in California. I wrote about this, and it will be in the new book. In California, we had. I started off in Koreatown in LA, and I drove through South LA, which is like Mumbai on a bad day. I get to these little Latino-run cities, working-class cities, no graffiti, almost no empty stores. And I realized when I talked to the city council people there, they would say, "Well, of course we have to take down the graffiti, or we can't get a cup of coffee without people yelling at us." In other words, this sense of community. These are places like Downey or Bellflower. Non-Californians would know these places.
Yeah.
These are cities of 50, 75,000 people, and so it's at that community level where things actually can work out. Where somebody could be a Republican and somebody could be a Democrat, but they agree that the graffiti is bad.
Yeah, when we I live pretty close to here, and it's a small town within Austin, and one of the things that has been a part of my life for the past 5 years is I walk down the street and I know all my neighbors.
Right.
So I stop and have conversations with James and Cindy and with Russ across the street and Melinda, and so and it's easy to talk about community in some abstraction.
Well, it's become an abstraction particularly among progressives.
Well, but even just the way I'm part of the Black community. It's like, what does that mean?
Right,
right. Community has a meaning, I think, and the meaning is it's people that that you interact with, that you have some sense.
It could be your parish or your synagogue or whatever religious group. That's another community.
But it's the sense of calm, the sense of everything's going to be okay.
Right.
Actually. It's so potent. You're reading the news, you're doom scrolling, and then you go walk down the street and you talk to your neighbor who voted the exact opposite way as you did, but you're talking about other stuff, and you're they're good people, and you don't, and it just that has to happen on a daily, weekly basis to not just degenerate.
Right. Well, and I mean, to Tocqueville, others have written about this. I mean, if you take a look at when we went to Italy for a month. We had two neighbors looking at the house. Another neighbor's kids were watering my wife's garden. I mean, I didn't need to. I need to find a government agency which will do that. I mean, one of the problems is we've substituted for government for what should be done on the grassroots basis.
Yeah.
One of the great faults, and I don't think it was ill-intentioned, of the Great Society is the idea that you would substitute government for what was being done in the community.
Yeah.
I mean, the
Society of Mutual Aid.
Right. And certainly the Black Church is one of the the great pillars, and the Catholic parish was a pillar. It was something that organized the society. And I think that my basic thesis is, if we follow the path we're on, we're going down a dark tunnel. Almost nobody thinks it's leading to something better. Maybe a few oligarchs who think that, will be better. I mean, I did a TV taping it was very interesting with Steven Spielberg and Jeff Katzenberg and Ray Kurzweil, who was the chief tech guy in Google. And at the end of it, I talked to one of the women who producers, said, "That's the scariest guy I've ever met in my life." I mean, I had just come back from
Mr. Singularity.
Yeah, I just came back from India, and he said, "Yeah," but I said, "Well, there's really terrible poverty," and I was in Dharavi, which is the biggest slum in the world.
I've been to Dharavi.
Okay, so you know what I'm talking about.
It's weird.
And he said,
I did this film with Arthur Brooks, and Dharavi was featured in his book, and so I went there and filmed it.
And so they said, "Well, yeah, but they have information technology." I said, "They live in squalor. Their lifespans are shorter. There are all sorts of diseases that should have been wiped out 100 years ago." "No, but they have information technology." I'm saying, okay.
As we sort of come to a close on our second marathon together, you've talked about going to synagogue. You're a Jewish American. Do you believe in God?
Kasich asked the same question today.
You're getting hit with it twice.
I wish I believed in God. I don't disbelieve in God. I just, I believe in the ideas that are ascribed to God. Many of them are very good ideas. I think religion is very important. But in my persona, I'm not sure. My daughters believe in God. My wife maybe as well, but for
Your
whatever,
wife maybe?
Yeah.
You don't know? You don't know, Joel?
No. Well, look, we don't talk about this. Judaism is very different than Christianity. It's largely a cultural, tribal identity as well as a religious identity. It's almost more like Confucian ancestor worship. It's like we do things because it would dishonor our ancestors not to do them.
I had an Orthodox Jewish girlfriend who, God rest her soul, died of cancer in her early 30s. Completely insane. Her father, I was at her home on 9/11. I had stayed over at her house. Her parents were lovely people in New Jersey, in Elizabeth, New Jersey. I was on a bus into the city the day of 9/11, heading to work. So I saw I saw the building smoking.
Right.
And then traffic came to a halt, went back to their house. And so I was in their living room as the towers came down. They were in the schmata business.
Right.
So that's why I know that word and the sort of textiles. And so I have a lot of affinity for Jews. I have more of a familiarity with Judaism than your typical goy. Why do you think you are the way you are? Because you're of a type, which is an intelligent, academically oriented Jewish person who's proud to be Jewish, but isn't sure about the God of Abraham. That's weird.
Well,
it's not weird, actually. It's quite common. But why do you think that is?
But
they believed in God. They were Orthodox. They were deeply engaged in the religion itself.
Well, my mother's father was basically a Red, so so there was no belief in religion at all. My mother wasn't the Red, but my grandfather was. And on the other side, they were Orthodox, sort of typical Orthodox. But my father was a doctor and taught in a medical school in New York. So I was brought up with a very scientific, looking for proof of things, trying to justify things. So it's just the way my mind is constructed. I'm not a great statistician by any stretch of the imagination, but I work with great statisticians. I know what questions to ask. There's that aspect of the Jewish personality, which is never to accept anything as given, always to question. And I think, to me, people like Spinoza are important. I think that that skepticism is one of our gifts to humanity. Just like the faith of the Orthodox are also a gift. Where I have a problem is with those Jews who basically side with people who want to kill us. Then I have a little problem with.
There's too many of them in New York right now.
There are too many of them. I'm writing an article about that.
It's like, what is this? What's happened here?
I call them the un-Jews, and basically, and they could actually read Hebrew better than me. They could they could go through the ritual. But how do you have a Passover Seder? And what are you going to say next year in Gaza? I mean, the whole theology and tradition is to look to Jerusalem. It's like telling somebody from Mecca, no, you shouldn't worship Mecca. You should worship towards Dubai because it's got better bars. I mean, this. I mean, I just think that there is a role that we've played, I think, in the history as skeptics, as discoverers, particularly on the intellectual side, and that is part of what we offer, and I hopefully that's part of what I offer. I'm made up of a lot of different things. You like Whitman would say. There are all these different elements. I mean, because again, as I get older, you start thinking about it. I've lost a lot of my friends, and my closest cousin, and you think about what matters. And I think my cousin died, but he had children and grandchildren.
Yeah,
there was something he left behind, and I think that whether I need to believe there's a God. Of course, one big difference is in Judaism, there isn't the emphasis on the afterlife that there is in Christianity.
Yeah, and I don't know this for a fact, strongly, but it does seem like one of the things that may have happened over the history, the post-Christian. Basically, you have Christ is crucified. It's like 70 AD that the temple is destroyed by the Romans,
right?
And so the Jews are effectively scattered across.
Well, there were two other rebellions,
and eventually you end up with this diaspora,
right?
That in a world that becomes increasingly Christian, and it does seem like maybe I'm talking out of my rear here, but there was a little bit of a counter mystical reaction to all of the talk about grace and the Holy Spirit and stuff of Christendom.
I think there's elements, although there are elements of that did exist in late Judaism before the destruction of the temple. So, and there's certainly the traditions, of the Baal Shem Tov and the sort of Hasid idea, which also has a lot of mysticism in it. So, but I think that there's no question that the idea of there being an afterlife and was very appealing. Of course, in many ways, it came more out of Greek or even Egyptian ideas than classically Jewish ideas. Is very undecided about whether there's an afterlife or not. But what the rabbis say basically is you have to live your life in an ethical way, not with the idea that you're going to be rewarded at the end.
It's like I mean, one of the things I'm curious about is how do you feel like during this whole period, 10/7, now this war in Iran, a war that the U.S. and Israel are the sole players. And it certainly played out like Israel struck first, and our Secretary of State literally said, well, we sort of felt like our hand was moved. That's the way it came across. How do you think about the changing shape of the Jewish identity against the backdrop of all of this stuff that's going on in the world? Because it's dynamic and crazy, and I have to imagine it's also quite a bit scary. I have a lot of Jewish friends who are terrified about the state of the world right now.
Well, I think there's good reason to feel that way. First of all, I think the United States had all sorts of reasons. Going back to the hostage crisis during the Carter years.
I mean, my take on that is quite simply: I hold my commander-in-chief responsible for the actions of the U.S. military, regardless of the circumstances, because that's what our system is.
But I think that. But there's frightening things happening. One would be the anti-Jewish feeling that is very obvious among a large part of many Muslim countries and many Muslims. Then you have this left-wing anti-Semitism, which is bizarre given who invented Marxism. But there's that, and now you've got on the right.
He hated the Jews too, though. So there's that.
Right. Well,
or at least it was complicated with Marx.
It was very complicated. But I think that there's also a large group on the right. Now, I don't think they're very indicative of the right wing public. The polls show that the Tucker Carlson wing of the Republican Party is about 6%. But
you mean in terms of views towards Israel and Jews more broadly?
Yeah, and
whatever.
And I don't think that the average Christian is going to say, "Oh, wow, we really need Sharia law. That's much better than the New Testament." I don't think that's a winning argument. But I think that the all this that's going on, and look, the fact that I don't want my daughter to go work in London is really, the city that is incredibly important to me, where much of my career is located, and yet I don't feel secure about it. My wife's family is from France, similar, and many of them are now in Canada, and it's really pretty bad there too. I think this is a very scary time for Jews. And what really, I mentioned earlier, the un-Jews, those who decide, like the new head of the NDP in Canada is a person who's Jewish. He's trying to get over the indoctrination he had as a kid. Any Jewish person who supported Mandami is, just, sort of in the Jews for Hitler routine. It's just beyond belief that you could. I could see where you might not have liked Cuomo. Was a bit of a thug, but
especially if you need grandparents during COVID,
right? But to support somebody whose core political views are basically to treat Israel as a pariah state, without ever saying anything about China, Russia, Sudan, whatever horrible country is out there. That's clearly an anti-Semitic worldview. Because why would you attack Israel for being against Muslims when compared to China, which puts them in concentration camps? I don't know. Seems to me to be somewhat worse. But it's a very dangerous time for Jews. I've even interviewed tech people here in Austin who are Jewish, Israelis, and they moved from the Bay Area to Austin because they felt safer here, and they didn't want their kids to be, abused at school. The fact that this is going on, I never, ever, ever felt that concern for myself. My brother never felt it for himself. My wife didn't feel it growing up in Montreal, even though there was always some conflicts there. And now it's something that, it's like we're back in, 1920.
There's a lot of things about the moment we're in that have these echoes from the past, whether it's the 20s. There's a lot of stuff that feels like the 20s. There's stuff that feels like a trash rehash of the late 60s, early 70s, like the worst sequel to the hippie times. Like 2020 as the Summer of Love is like the sequel to the hippies we could possibly gotten. And then there's some things that are like, oh, this is going back a little further now, and I'm not sure I'm feeling too good about it. You'd mentioned, you'd said basically almost resigned to it, or as a way of the world, perhaps, that, the U.S. is the new Rome. We are an empire. The way of this planet and the people on it ends up going that way. Are we in a civilizational struggle against Islam in a genuinely ideological / theological sense? I think the West versus Islam, is that a real thing?
I think it is. It certainly, if the Iranian worldview is there, for sure. Among the Sunnis, it seems to be more nuanced, and again, among the Persians, they prefer to be thought of as Persians and connected to a great civilization.
Yeah, back to Cyrus the Great.
Right. And way beyond that. Yeah. This was a a great civilization, which was, excelled in all sorts of areas and had a multinational empire. Some of those people, they may be Muslims, but they're not. They're not like the people running the current regime. So I don't think we're in a war against Islam per se. I think we're in a war against certain forms of Islam, just like we were in wars against certain ideologies in the Second World War. And so I think that I have too many Muslim friends and too many good associations. The guy who used to do our social media was from Pakistan, and I went to his wedding at a mosque, and people treated us very well. I think the problem is people who, if you will, weaponize or turn what is a good thing into a bad thing. And the same thing with Christianity. You think, the great ideas in Christianity, were the Crusades a good idea? I don't think so.
Some first ones weren't so bad.
Well, what wasn't so bad if you
preventing all of Europe from being taken over by the not the Ottomans, but by essentially the Islamic invading forces.
Actually, the history.
Right?
I think your history is a little off. The big threat before the Turks was Charles Martel, and it was really because the Muslims took control of Jerusalem, and then
Constantinople, and
right?
Isn't that? We'll get it. This is a tangent that we'll save for another day.
But I think that
let's agree that the Inquisition was no bueno.
Okay, and I think that ultimately, I think every religion has within it the seeds of despotism and the seeds of salvation, and I think that's true of Islam as well as any others. Yes, there are parts of Islam that in the Quran that are very militant, and there is that tendency. But there are parts of there. You can talk to some of the ultra nationalist Jews in Israel, and they're not so different. I mean, fortunately, they're not the majority, and they don't control the government completely. But they're. And obviously with Christianity, I mean, if you've got some guy who thinks that you shouldn't have Catholic processions in the United States, in a country in which the Catholicism is the largest religion, I think there's something wrong there.
It's like we are a tribal creature that hasn't really changed. I'd like to think, and I'm inspired a lot by Tom Holland's book, Dominion, on this, that one of the major contributions to Western civilization of Christianity culturally was that the notion of the secular as a space.
Right.
He maps that. It's maybe the most interesting thing out of that book, which is that the idea that the secular was not a thing. When you go in history, if you go to India, if you look at Hindu culture, if you look at the religion was an interwoven fact of all aspects of reality, that was not separable into something like a theology and then a secular life. That was something that emerged out of the Christian Europe.
Well, I would say it had a lot to do with Rome, but that's another.
But I mean, I think it's like that's in and of itself feels like a civilizational experiment that we're grappling with, and that's difficult. It's like, can you maintain a secular governance against all of human history's sort of tendencies towards sectarianism?
Well, I mean, the founding fathers sort of got there, and so it's obviously doable.
Republic, if we can keep it.
Right. But also that, that one of the first things the revolutionaries did is they got rid of the state religions in many cases, and eventually it was, you couldn't have a state religion anymore. I think that was a great contribution, and I'm hoping that we keep that. I think we will keep it, if nothing else, because there's no religious majority left.
Well, and this will be the interesting thing as we move forward. I think this is a great place to wrap things up. Joel, any final words before you head to the airport?
I'm going to dinner actually with a friend.
Even better, better than going to the airport.
Tomorrow I go to the airport. I would just think that the thing I'm thinking about most of all is how do we approach improving our society, not through politics, but through something else. Certainly not through national politics. I think that if more reporters focused on what was happening in their local communities, what was happening with their neighbors, what were happening in their families, what was happening in the congregations, I think we'd be much better off. That to go and obsess over this idiot media world, whether it's Hollywood or Washington, D.C. or New York, and act as that is the whole world. It is not. It's not the best part of the world, and it's not where the solutions are going to come from.
I couldn't agree with you more. Joel Kotkin, well, thanks for coming back on Dad Saves America. This was a blast.
Great. I enjoyed it too.